Hi, I'm Dr. Alan Rutberg. I am the Director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. I'm here today to talk a bit about myself and my history, as well as how I fit into the MAPP program. The Center for Animals and Public Policy has been part of the Cummings community almost since the beginning in the 1980s. Our vision is animals and people flourishing together, which means that our work is based on the tenets that animal well-being matters, that animal and human well-being are linked, and both are enhanced through improved understanding of human-animal relationships. We have 4 areas of focus, which is a function of our faculty. My specialty is human-animal interactions with wildlife. Human-wildlife conflict, urban wildlife, policy and ethics of managing wildlife are all sort of in my domain. Our other faculty members, who have also made some recordings, occupy some of those other spaces. But today we're going to talk about wildlife because it's me. So just for some background on me, I started off as a behavioral ecologist. Did my PhD at the National Bison Range in Yellowstone National Park in Montana and in Wyoming, and was interested in cow-calf relationships and timing of reproduction and some other stuff. And I went on from there to Assateague Island National Seashore in Maryland. And worked on horses because I was interested in how wild horses differed so much in social organization from bison, even though they basically did the same thing ecologically. While I was there, I ran into John Turner and Jay Kirkpatrick, the gentleman on the lower right, who introduced me to wild horse contraception, and I will get back to that. But anyway, I taught liberal arts college biology for about 7 years until I ended up being hired by the Humane Society of the United States as a wildlife advocate. So I was senior scientist for wildlife and habitat protection for HSUS for about 10 years. And I worked on a lot of urban deer issues, trying to argue for humane solutions to deer conflicts, which I'll also talk about in a minute. I also worked on bison and the Yellowstone Bison Management Plan, and worked more on endangered species and on wild horses, which is a theme for me as well. I also started doing research with John and Jay and their colleague Erwin Liu on wild horse contraception and then on deer contraception. And again, the point of these is to help solve problems with abundance of horses on Western public lands for the most part, and then deer in suburban communities. And have been doing that ever since. So at CAPP, aside from doing the research and related policy that I'll be talking about, human-wildlife conflict, public lands, wild horse management, and applications of wildlife fertility control, I also teach a lot in the MAPP program. And so I teach both the policy and the wildlife modules of the core flagship Animals and Society class. I teach an elective in wildlife and captivity, which also enrolls conservation medicine and veterinary students, which makes it quite fun to see the different perspectives. I teach a spring course in communicating policy positions, which teaches you to unlearn all the things you might have learned as an academic in terms of your writing, and to write briefly in clear declarative sentences and express strong opinions without qualifications. And I also do a little bit of work in statistics. So let's get on to some business here. So I've been working with urban wildlife issues for decades. And of course, humans have massively modified habitat to meet our own needs, right? And so we build shopping centers and we build housing and we create farms and we do all kinds of things to the landscape that suit our needs. Um, Now, we talk a lot about endangered species, which don't do well on the landscapes that we create, but there's a whole nother class of species that do really well on human-dominated landscapes. And those are the human-wildlife conflict species. So deer, raccoons, beaver, geese, coyotes, all kinds of things do really well. And so we see a lot of them in our neighborhoods. Deer in particular are a knotty problem. The biggest issue with deer is deer vehicle collisions, right? Because it causes a lot of vehicle damages, it causes a lot of injuries, causes about 150 human deaths a year, and of course, um, typically kills the deer who were hit. So that's the most severe issue. But there's also a lot of concern about consumption of ornamental plantings, of crops, of nursery plants. The picture up there is my house in Maryland, and it's a little bit hard to see, but there's nothing growing below about 3.5 feet because the deer strip all the vegetation from the shrubs and the trees around the house. There are also broader ecological impacts in parks, for example. Um, and of course, there's always an association with Lyme disease, which is a concern. Um, and although it's not really directly related to deer, there's sort of an interesting and complicated biological connection that makes people think about deer when they think about Lyme disease. So um, this graph shows the trends in harvests of deer in the state of Massachusetts from about 1966 to essentially the present time. Um, the black line is the one to pay attention to on top. And what this shows is that every year the harvest increases and has been increasing more or less consistently for the last 60 years. Um, and and meanwhile, the number of hunters is actually declining. So this is because there are more deer, not because there are more hunters. So the conditions really support deer population growth. Um, and of course, many of these deer are in suburbs and cities and towns. And this creates conflicts that are really hard to manage. And they're really hard to manage for three big reasons. One is there aren't a lot of good tactics for mitigating deer impacts. There is no National Institute of Human Wildlife Conflict, so there's not a lot of money behind this. And it turns out to be quite challenging. The public is super divided with respect to how humans relate to nature. And so you get people who love deer and people who hate deer and people who like deer but feel there are too many and all sorts of other branches off those views. So that makes any proposed action controversial. And finally, the policy mechanisms are awkward and really outdated. So really, the wildlife management system in the United States was devised in the 1920s and hasn't really changed much since then, even though conditions have changed and hunting has changed and the values that people have about wildlife has changed a lot since then. So there are two general classes of ways to deal with deer conflicts. One is what's described as living with deer, which is mitigation. So you change human behavior to accommodate the presence of deer. People talk about public education because everybody likes public education, but it's not clear that it works. And the other approach, of course, is deer population control of various kinds. So mitigation takes a number of different forms, right? So again, with deer vehicle collisions being the first issue, the first thing is to drive carefully. And the same things that, same hints, the same way you should drive for avoiding deer is the same way we should drive generally. So you wear your seatbelt, you don't speed, and you stay alert. There are also modifications that you can do to the road that make deer a little bit more visible, and maybe the roadside's a little less attractive to deer. You can grow less palatable plants in your gardens, or you can use fences and barricades to keep deer out. With respect to ticks, landscaping can help keep tick numbers down. Tick checks, do them all the time. And of course, don't feed deer. And many people do. And it generally is whether it's good for deer or bad for deer, it's generally a source of conflict. Alternatively, you can approach this problem by trying to control populations of deer. And you can do that lethally or non-lethally. And the two ways people kill deer is through public hunts um, or through professional culls. Public hunts are very attractive to state wildlife agencies. They are relatively inexpensive to conduct, um, and um, and are popular as far as sources of revenue for the state agencies. The alternative professional culls tend to be much more expensive, tend to be effective, but also tend to be pretty unpopular, even with whether you're talking about hunters or non-hunters. They make people kind of squeamish. There are also two approaches to non-lethal population control. One is surgical sterilization. Surgical sterilization is pretty invasive. It requires um, tranquilizing animals in the field, bringing them to a surgical suite, a portable or mobile surgical suite, opening them up. If they're males, vasectomizing them. If they're females, removing their internal organs, then closing them up and letting them recover, and then releasing them. Obviously, it requires special expertise, um, but on the other hand, it's one and done, which is to say, once the animal has been sterilized, you don't have to worry about it breeding again. The alternative is injectable contraceptives, which are much less invasive because they can be delivered by dart in the field, or even if you capture them, you can hand inject them and let them go without the extended anesthesia, without any surgical treatments. Disadvantages is they are reversible, which is to say they require repeat treatments in all the current forms. And so, whereas with surgical sterilization, they're one and done, injectable contraceptives require multiple injections. What I've been working with for the last 3 decades is the porcine zona pellucida immunocontraceptive vaccine. So this contraceptive vaccine is a protein. It's extracted from pig ovaries. And like all vaccines, it works by raising an antibody response. And vaccinating females, in this case, with PZP, yields antibodies that block fertilization. Essentially, they bind to the receptors that allow sperm to enter the egg. And so by blocking those receptors, they keep sperm out of the eggs. This was first field tested on wild horses at Astig Island National Seashore in Maryland back in the late 1980s. It was extremely effective, 90 to 95% effective, and ongoing pregnancies were not affected by PZP treatment, so there were minimal effects on behavior. However, it did require multiple injections, 2 in the initial year and then annual boosters, which works on Astig, but not in a lot of other places. So PZP can be delivered in a dart like that, or it could be hand injected. As I say, there are 2 forms. One is native PZP, which is just an emulsion that goes in a dart, and that's the one that requires annual boosters, because that is not very practical in a lot of settings with a lot of animals that don't stick around to be retreated. We've developed another form of the vaccine, PCP22, which includes the emulsion, the liquid part, and also adds to it 3 control release pellets that release PZP over time and simulate booster shots. The PZP22 works extremely well with deer. These are data from 2 sites, Fripp Island in South Carolina, and Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, um, right on the Hudson River. Um, and in both cases, untreated animals have 80 to 90% fertility, which is to say 9 out of 10 deer have fawns every year. And after the first year of treatment in both sites, PZP22 reduced reproduction to about 5 to 15% in the first year, remained low for the second year, and was still a bit lower than normal in the third year, although the sample sizes got pretty small in the third year. So it appears to work for 2 to 3 years with a single dose. It also turns out that if you give them a booster, it lasts even longer. So you can give them the PZP22 initial treatment, and then you can boost them with either PZP22 or the simpler and much cheaper emulsion form, the native PZP. And the native PZP, either way, you get at least 3 and probably more years of population or of contraception. Again, the sample sizes are pretty small in year 4. It looks like it's still low, but we don't really know how long it actually lasts. So that's pretty exciting. And what that means is that over roughly a 7-year period, you can get pretty effective contraception with just 2 shots. We've also shown population effects, which is very cool. This is from Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. It's notable in that whereas in most of the other study sites, the populations were effectively on islands, or at least there were major obstacles to them moving around. Hastings-on-Hudson is it's on the river, but on 3 sides it is open, and deer can move in and out. And we show that even in a geographically open population, we can get really substantial reductions. So again, the numbers we often pay attention to the most are the number of females, which are the ones that drive population growth. And we saw there roughly a 50 or higher percent reduction in population over a 5-year period, which is awesome. Most communities will be really happy with that. And it makes the deer noticeably less visible and also generally puts them in better condition, which is a whole nother subject. So we've actually gotten population reductions on 3, arguably 4 sites at this point. So that's pretty exciting. So it's an effective management tool. So across the board, we've had accomplishments and we have had challenges. We now know that PZP22, the controlled release version, is safe, it's effective, and it's a one-shot vaccine that works at least for 1 year. We've also tested on free-roaming horses, and it has similar effects in horses. The boosters last at least 3 years, which is very exciting. And so you can think about, now that you don't have to treat them every year, but you can treat them maybe every 3 or 4 years, that becomes a much more realistic tool. It has been EPA registered as a pesticide, which is a whole nother topic, but a regulatory quirk, which has interesting policy implications. We have reduced deer populations at several suburban sites. And for horses, there are multiple small-scale volunteer-led PZP darting projects on some of the Western public lands, which is pretty exciting. However, recent results that we've had some inconsistent effectiveness in some of the recent field trials, which may have to do with standardizing manufacturing. There is in the US no widespread application for either deer or horses. So we have a tool, but it's frustrating that people are not really using it as broadly as it could be, given their effectiveness. And so there are a lot of political and regulatory obstacles for both deer and wild horses. They're somewhat different in nature for deer and wild horses. And the other thing that we're running into is there is ethical opposition and legal challenges from the animal rights community, which isn't necessarily something you'd expect, but it raises some very interesting ethical questions. So we've made a ton of progress. It's been long enough, not as much as we'd hoped, and we're very close, at least technically, to a tool that works. And so now we have some other hurdles to jump that are less technical and more political. A lot of this now depends on wildlife ethics and values, as I started talking about in the context of human-wildlife conflicts in suburbs. There's just a whole range of views of how wildlife should be treated and how humans should relate to nature. And so we have everything from the sort of ecological balance view of people and nature to a peaceable kingdom view, where everything would be great if we all just left each other alone. Then there's sort of more aggressive, domineering, and commercial views of nature, which fortunately have receded a little bit. At least the commercial views are no longer part of the North American scene, but still plenty of admiration for trophy hunting, and also sort of more sort of spatial views where people think wildlife belongs in some places but not others. So you're a conservation who believes in conservation in Africa, but not necessarily supporting wildlife in your own backyard. And there are some interesting indigenous views about links between human and nature. And they all come together in dealing with these wildlife-human conflicts. So I think a lot about that. So getting back to the MAPP program, our goals for you are to prepare you to work in animal policy. And we do that by building your analytical skills, your research skills, your communication skills through classes and through practice. We expose you to a wide range of animal issues and a wide range of views about animal issues. So we talk about wildlife, obviously, but we also spend a lot of time on companion animals, on animals in research, animals in production on farms. So if you are interested in animals and how people take care of animals and interested in maybe making the world a better place for animals, this is a good option for you. Again, one of the things we really like to do is expose you to different views and help you understand where they come from and help you fairly evaluate both the different views of animals and the science that comes out of different schools of thinking about animals. And so you'll see a lot of that in the program. So application deadlines, again, for February, for 2026, February 2nd and April 1st. If you get it in for February 2nd, the application fee is waived. And we would love to see you. And if you have any questions, we'll be holding a Q&A shortly. And you can always contact the center at any time, either at our website, or you can email me at alan.rutberg@tufts.edu. So thank you for your time, and we'll hopefully see you soon.